Okay, so this is the prelude to the Conservation Economics Week, and I'm just going to go over briefly today in this YouTube some of the topic areas that we're going to cover, and then we'll use case studies within the lecture to cover them. So, three major overarching questions that we'd like to address. One is, can conservation afford to operate without economic justification of cost effectiveness? And this is an argument that Gretchen Daly with the Natural Capital Project and others have made, and I'll talk a bit about that. We can turn that over and say, can economics be harnessed in support of biodiversity conservation? So when we start to measure how much biodiversity is worth to us, what do those numbers look like? How do they add up? And then a third topic is thinking about environmental justice, equitability of environmental benefits, and how can conservation, or should conservation, pay attention to and use economics to assess environmental justice and how we're doing. So we can go back to our slide that we've seen now a few times and think about utilitarianism or instrumentalism and intrinsic value, and then a pragmatist argument. And a utilitarian argument is one that fits well with an economic a foundation for understanding conservation. So if we're saying that what we're doing is conserving natural resources for anthropocentric purposes for us, then it dictates an economic viewpoint. Even if it's defined broadly, we want to make sure that we're only spending as much money on conservation as we gain benefit from that. So we could be spending money on other things, and we want to know what the relative value of this conservation is to us. And that's a pretty slippery thing to do. It's hard to get at a number of how much a polar bear or a bald eagle is worth. But nonetheless, other things are more measurable, things like how much is the value of pollinator services in agricultural products. So Claire Kremen at UC Berkeley, for example, has been studying the value that farmers in the Central Valley gain from native bees as pollinators of their ecosystems. And so you can estimate how much what the value of that is. The existence value of species is a more difficult thing to evaluate, and we'll talk a bit about that too. And then a second bit is this idea of these intrinsic values, and that people who strongly adhere to the view that we're protecting biological diversity for its own sake, that it's a value to itself and we should be attentive to that for no other purpose than just the existence value of those other species, they often have problems with this economics of conservation. So even if you can estimate an economic value of a species, should you? And you can think about it this way and liken it to this. How much is your life worth? Well, obviously to you, it's worth an infinite amount of money. But how much is your life worth to society? Well, insurance companies can figure that out. And based on a lot of metrics of how much people are willing to pay for insurance for their lives, and that we can then estimate this value. But it's very uncomfortable, and we often think, I just think it's wrong to place a dollar value on a human life. And one might also think that it's fundamentally wrong to place a dollar value on the polar bears as a species or panda bears as a species. We also have problems in terms of thinking about economics values, because the markets don't always work. I mean, in an ideal free market society, then values are transparent and that they express themselves. But we know that there are all sorts of reasons why this doesn't happen, and why short-term interests often trump long-term interests, and that we can have failure for those values to express, and that therefore people who are interested in intrinsic values often think that we don't really know enough about the functioning of these resources to make accurate economic arguments. If we go down to the bottom there, Gretchen Daly at Stanford and others have made this argument that there's a pragmatic argument, and that is, if we want to do conservation, we're going to have to mainstream it. We're going to have to make sure that people are on board and interested in conserving things, and that's what we were talking about last week. So, in order to make conservation, they argue that making conservation cost-effective, it's not an option. It is what makes it socially palatable, and for that reason, we should pay attention. Now, there is a fundamental problem, and that problem lies here, in that we have population growth that is skyrocketing, and that this growth places pressure on resources, and that we would need to maximize the efficient use of goods of nature. So we want efficient and effective ways of using those extractable resources. And people are now talking more about sustainability because we feel like we're not doing that well. But again, that's a utilitarian point of view. But this growth also places pressure on what remains to nature for the majority of that biodiversity that doesn't coexist well with people. There's a lot of species that don't thrive in and around people, and that there's less and less of that space for that biological diversity, and economic growth presents a challenge. And Brian Check and others have argued that fundamentally a growth-based economic system creates incentives for increased consumption. So even if you had no population growth, our measure of success as an economy would be that we have more wealth, and we express that wealth with stuff, and therefore having more resources. So anywhere from being a Maasai with more cattle to an American with more cars, more stuff means more pressure on the environment. And then we have these social concerns that suggest we should increase economic equitability. And if you've seen things like any kind of economic footprint, carbon footprint, ecological footprint, you'd know that relative to most of the world's population, the developed countries like the US and Europe and Australia have a very high relative resource consumption rate. And if we were to make the world a better place for people, that means bringing other people up to this economic speed, and that means it's a worse place for biological diversity. So one way to take a peek at this is just looking at the U.S. federal budget. So 17% of the budget is discretionary. That's the orange wedge off to the left. That's $615 billion each and every year. So people often talk about these fixed expenditures, these entitlements, and they include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other mandatory benefits. We're paying a fair chunk on interest to the American debt, and we have a big wedge in there for the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense is more or less about the same as how much we spend on stuff we choose to spend on during the year. So of that 17%, of that $615 billion each year, we spend 12 of those go to the Department of Interior. That is about 2% or so of that total budget. That might be bad math. You might check that. I did it, and then I wrote it down, and I misplaced it. So if you look at more detail in the budget, this is what that budget looks like. All these little up here, these are all these discretionary spending bits. The Department of Interior is in there for that $12.3 billion. Let's put that into some kind of perspective. That the annual Department of Interior expenditures is about worth 10 Jennifer Anistons. It's about 20% of the annual cost of wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, and it's about 10% of annual Medicaid spending in the state of California alone. The point of all this, we don't spend that much money on the environment, and as a consequence, we are challenged to get it right. And we do put other parts of the environment into an economic framework. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency has a Center for Environmental Economics, and they're going to ask what is the value of a human life and what is the cost of reducing air pollution and what is the probability that that air pollution is going to cause a loss of human life, and that this is a way that we value and decide how much air pollution protection is worthwhile. And so we're beginning to see this crop up already. So the question then is, should we be doing this with other parts of our economy? And there's many different ways we can try and do that, and I'm going to go through some of these. There's cost-benefit analyses, stated preferences, revealed preferences, direct cost estimation, and examples of this, of thinking about how much are we willing to pay for threatened and endangered species. And you get numbers like this. And we're going to go into this in a little more detail. I'll go over this one again. But the conclusion is that the actual cost of conserving these species falls well below our willingness to pay. Now, there's a fundamental problem with this kind of analysis, is that we say we won't be willing to pay for this. But to whom are we going to pay this money? Are we paying this money to NGOs to do conservation? Possibly. Are we paying this money to the federal government to do their job in managing these species? Well, the American people have been quite clear over the last several years that they aren't interested in increased taxes. And if we think we're willing to pay more, increase the fraction of the U.S. budget for wildlife, and we're not willing to pay more for taxes, then what we're doing is combining this with a willingness to stop paying for something else. And so you'd have to define what it is, what's the other thing that you're no longer going to pay for. And that is kind of a problem with all of these sorts of assessments. So the other major approach is to think about ecological production functions, predict how an ecological service is valued, extrapolate that the broader distribution of those functions, and then try and make an argument for how that should be protected given the value it provides to society. A separate way of looking at this are these efficiency horizons, and we'll go into one of these in some detail, but it's saying if you divided the world into economic development and conservation, you might think that there are many different alternatives for protecting the landscape that fall along some set of lines. And if there was this direct trade-off between economic value and conservation, we'd expect a straight line going diagonally down like this, and that we would want to make a societal choice about where we want to be along that line. It turns out that this is an empirical study, and it's for the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and that we actually are somewhere on I and J. But these authors make the argument that if you did smart land planning, that you could move anywhere along this line from A through H and either allocate land use to economic gain at the expense of biodiversity or biodiversity at the expense of economic gain, but that with smart planning and the smart distribution of both those economic resources and that conservation, you could be out here in the DE range where you're gaining most of the environmental value while retaining, most of the economic value while retaining most of the biological diversity value, and that this is a reason to think about economics because we can do better at both things when doing so. A final thing that we're going to try and look at a little bit is this idea of these environmental footprints and environmental justice. And you can stop this and read this figure legend, but basically it's depicting some set of people over here who utilize resources under the land area less than the land area they occupy. Others, you can guess who they are using resources in excess of the land area that they're using, which means that they're gaining their environmental benefit from at the expense of other people. And then we can think about this as an environmental justice, that this Kuznets curve, in thinking about income per capita, the argument is made that this is usually this hyperbolic curve, or this parabolic curve like this, and that people have used this to look at things like pollution as well, where when there's very low income in society, there's very low capacity to have inequality among that income, and there's very little capacity to pollute, that as you increase economic well-being, you have the capacity to increase inequitability, and in the pollution terms, increased capacity to pollute. But as you gain even more income, you can reduce that inequality. You can also reduce the capacity to pollute. My 15 minutes is up, so I am going to stop there, and we will pick that up on Monday. See ya.